Welcome to the Imperfectly Happy Radio Hour with Tiffany Davis. Broadcasting from her micro homestead in Phoenix, Arizona, Tiffany shares everything with her unique humor and sincerity as she brings you intriguing guests on topics from homesteading to homeschooling and everything in between. The information, advice, and opinions shared on this show are for informational purposes only and should be implemented at your own discretion. Visit Tiffany on her blog at www.imperfectlyhappy.com, where imperfectly happy is just perfect enough. Now, let's join the show.
Well, welcome to the Imperfectly Happy Homesteader. This is your host, Tiffany Davis. I'm going to have to ask you to please excuse my rough voice. I am still recovering from a cold, and it seemed to just take home in my throat. So I sound a little rough today, but we're muscling through this. Today is Veterans Day, so I want to begin the show by starting by just saying thank you to those men and women in the military, past, present, and future, who have served and protected our country. Your service is greatly appreciated, and I thank you. Today's guest is Donna Bruce of Sharing Life's Abundance. Donna is a 30-year gardening veteran, and today she's going to share with us her composting basics, composting 101, if you will. So welcome to the show, Donna.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you back again. So this is your second time on the show, and I'm excited to share with the listeners your knowledge in composting because I've learned a lot from you. I know that you like to say that you're cuckoo for composting, so why don't you tell us what that's all about?
Well, the reason that I say I'm cuckoo for composting is because when I moved to Arizona and started gardening 30 years ago, I found that composting was the number one thing that I could do to ensure the health of my plants. So I have spent the last 30 years trying to understand and trying to find new ways of working with my compost.
That's a pretty good reason to be cuckoo for it. I know it's pretty awesome. When you get it right, it is just invaluable in the garden. So let's start with just getting started with composting. I know that it can feel a little daunting to some people, kind of like a science project. So how do you suggest that people get started?
Well, we did discuss that this would be Composting 101, so I'm going to just do a very basic explanation of getting started. When I have a class or someone that wants to start gardening, I teach them, do not start a garden bed, start a compost bed. I know that you, Tiffany, like your square foot garden boxes. I've read about on your blog. Yeah. So let's say you were my new gardener. I would say go ahead and build that garden box. But instead of going to the store and finding bags of this and that to fill it with, I would suggest that you start that box as a composting box.
So right in that box that you intend to future use as a gardening box, that's where you're going to start the compost?
Yes, because I grow directly in compost. I've heard people say that you shouldn't do that, but the method that I've come up with for myself works wonderfully. Are you ready to start?
Okay. Yeah, let's hear about it. Let's hear about your method.
Okay, my method, a lot of times people start their garden boxes with some form of weed barrier. So let's just say we've got a weed cloth down to keep the weeds from coming underneath. So we're going to start with I'm going to say an inch layer of soil. Where are you going to get that soil? As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. If you've got a rock yard, move some of that rock around and dig some of that nasty, hard, we're talking Arizona here, it's nasty, hard clay soil. Take a pick and pull some of that out and use that to start with, because that soil has native microbes in it, It's fine. I like to actually drive up to Prescott, Flagstaff, Payson, and bring home a 5-gallon pail with me. But it doesn't matter. You can use what you've got.
So
then the next
just your
layer,
backyard dirt would work.
Backyard dirt would be fine.
Okay.
There's living stuff in that dirt.
Great.
Okay, so the next layer is our green layer, and I'm going to use an inch of green layer. And many people know that the green layer is things like newly chopped mowed grass. It's animal manures if you have access to it. It's your kitchen garden, your kitchen scraps, your peels, your coffee grounds. Miss Tiffany Davis, I know you like your coffee grounds.
I do indeed.
Ground eggshells, all of that stuff is considered the green, and you want a good inch of that. Then the next part of our layering is 3 inches of browns, which is the dead leaves, the straw, the bedding from our animals, the shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard. And one thing to remember, a leaf is a green if it's a green. If it's brown, it's a brown. So that will help you. Then, when we're done with our layers, we put another inch of dirt on top. And then we continue that layer. So if you're working with a 4 foot by 4 foot, and let's say it's 10 to 12 inches deep, you're going to do 2 or 3 layers of that. And I would even suggest that you mound it high, because as your compost starts to decay, it will shrink. And you want your bed to be full when you're done.
Now, have you ever used more of that throw and go method, where you've got, say, a container, like a garbage can with holes in it, where you're just throwing things in as you have it and then mixing as you go? Have you ever used that method, and how does that compare to a layered bed like you're using?
I have used that method, and I will tell you, because I don't always have a whole bunch of browns at the same time. But I found that the pile doesn't heat up as well, and when we get into composting, the next chapter in this series, we'll understand some things about how the microbes eat and reproduce and create heat and die back. And when we get into that, you'll understand. But the layers actually create the healthiest, fastest growing compost as far as I'm concerned. That pile will heat up beautifully if you layer it right. And
so how long does it normally take for, say, that 4 to 6 inches, or I guess you said 10 inches. I'm thinking my beds are about 6 inches. But if you've got a 12 or 10 to 12-inch bed, how long is that going to take to fully break down?
Once I have my bed full of composting ingredients, that's when I start my time clock. And my time clock, the way it works for me, takes about 3 months. But I have 12 garden beds, and I start a new garden bed every month. But not everybody has that. So I'm going to suggest that if you're going to start a fall garden, start your compost bed at the beginning of the summer.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, what about, I know when I talk about composting, a lot of questions come up about the pests that you might encounter, like roaches or flies or rodents. Have you seen that in your composting? And if so, how do you keep that under control? How do you keep them out?
Okay, first of all, I never use any meats, bone scraps. I know a lot of farmers do it, but when you have a 4-foot tall compost pile, you can get away with that. I don't use any meat products out there. I really don't use fruit. Fruit will attract fruit flies. You will get flies. The way to handle flies is the same way they do it on the farm. On a farm, you get a cow pie, and it's a nice moist place for a fly to lay its eggs, for the larva to hatch and create more flies. So the way to handle that is to chop up that cow pie and dry it out. Well, one of the things that I tell you with your compost is to water it every day. So that sounds like it's going to draw flies. The way I take care of flies with my compost pile is when I do use these kitchen scraps and animal manures that are going to naturally attract the flies, I cover it with dirt when I add it. So I make sure, I cover it. I make sure that I do my layering and cover it with dirt, and that will keep the flies from coming to your stuff. And keep your dogs out of it, too.
That's another good reason to use. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I was going to say keep your dogs and cats out of it, too, because people may not want to admit this, but dogs and cats attract just as many flies as any other animal in the backyard.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We've talked about how to layer it. We've talked about prevention of pests, which just makes sense. Now and how long it's going to take us. We need to give us about a 3-month run before we're going to be able to use that in the garden. But how do we actually know that the compost is ready? What are we looking for when we look at that compost to know, this is garden ready?
All right, we're going to get more into that also in the second part of the series. However, when you layer it properly, what you're doing is you're creating a food base for these very important microbes that do the composting for you. When your microbes are attracted to your pile, they're going to go, ooh, here's food. And once they start finding their food source, they start eating, and then, of course, they start reproducing. And their eating and their reproducing causes heat. And that's what we talk about, our compost pile heating up. So I leave that when I start my time clock of, okay, now my compost bed is full. I start my clock, and I start waiting for signs that this is happening. And by about 3 weeks, what happens is the pile heats up. The microbes have eaten just about everything that they can find to eat. They're now starting to die off, so the pile is going to start cooling. At the 3-week time, I will turn my pile and oxygenate it, and that will give the microbes some new energy to start eating and reproducing and heating up again. And at that point, I will start turning my pile once a week. What I will start seeing from that point on is my bits that I have added no longer look like the bits that I added. They don't look like eggshells anymore or carrot peelings. I'm starting to see that black, wonderful, fluffy, yummy black gold that people call it. By the time you've been cooking and turning for 3 months, you will have it.
That's great. I want to go back a little bit to the ingredients that we talked about. Now, you're saying animal manure. What animal manure would you recommend using in your compost pile, and which ones should we steer clear of?
Okay. Steer clear of any animal that eats meat, cats and dogs. I like to use rabbit manure. I like to use chicken manure, and usually that's by way of the straw and the bedding that I've raked from a chicken pen. Cow manure is great. Horse manure works, although I've heard a lot of people say horse manure seems to have more weed seeds in it. I don't know if that's true because I don't use horse manure simply because I don't have access.
Gotcha. So you can actually end up growing things if you're bringing in a seed through the feces. You can end up growing something in that compost pile.
You can. I've read where the seeds actually get killed off in the heat up process, but I've also had some of the best squash plants I've ever grown come up out of a compost pile. So, yeah, there's truth in a little bit of truth in both of it.
Okay. All right, so tell me, how do worms work in your compost, or do they?
Are we talking earthworms?
Yes, because
okay.
I've seen your compost piles for myself, so I know you have worms in there. But are you suggesting that people add worms to their compost pile, or just sort of allow nature to do that for them? That if worms come in, that's great. If they don't, that's okay too, because compost is going to work either way.
And that's true, but the old saying, build it and they will come. You build a compost pile, you give the right kind of food, and microbes will come and start breaking down things to the level that now this stuff is attractive to the earthworms. And so now there's a food source for the earthworms, and if there's an earthworm anywhere around you, it will come to your backyard to eat your compost. So
now, do you find that if you're putting weed cloth down that they're not being able to get in there, though?
No, I don't find that, because my whole garden, my whole backyard, 800 square feet of it, was all I used weed cloth, and I've never added a worm to my compost. They just come, and I don't know, outer space. I don't know where they come from, but they're there.
Some of the worms are passing out flyers. Come on over here, pest compost in town. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I know you're saying you are planting fully 100% compost. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, everything that I've read as a newbie gardener, and even now, was saying, using that compost more as a fertilizer. So what do you suggest for someone that's just getting started? They may not have enough. Now, I guess if they're doing the full box, they're going to have an entire box full already ready to go with compost. But if they have a smaller space, maybe they're doing it in a container, do you find that it goes well with more as a fertilizer than just as a straight soil to use?
Well, compost is definitely a good top dressing. And remember, I'm talking about Arizona because our soil is so poor. Other places in the country, California, for instance, you can put a seed next to a broomstick, and that little plant will climb up the broomstick with almost no help from yourself. So I've been doing this planting in compost because of our poor soil. Not everybody's going to want to follow my method. Yeah.
And I know that I was talking last week about how I'm doing it, and because I don't have as much compost right now, I'm using a container, I layer in about 2 inches in. I mix it in with some not-so-great soil, and then the compost, and then some potting soil, and I just sort of mix it in all together, and it's worked wonderfully. And I do think that compost makes all the difference, whether it's if you're planting directly into compost or you're using it as a fertilizer. So I know that it is
absolutely
it's the key. It's the key to a beautiful vegetable garden. Do you think that composting can help as more than a fertilizer, but also as in terms of pest control when you're actually growing in it? Because I hear things about that, but I've never seen that to be true thus far in my garden. But I wondered what your experience with that is.
Okay. First of all, when people say not to grow in pure compost, what they're really saying is don't grow in unfinished compost. Because while compost is composting, it will rob the soil of the nutrients that it needs in order to finish its job. Once your compost is finished, then you can plant in it. So that might have been confusing for some people. Anytime you give a plant what it needs to be healthy, whether it's the right amount of water, the right amount of sun, the right amount of shade, the right amount of nutrients, the right type of soil, whether it be pH, whether it be whatever, anytime you give the plant something to be healthy, it will be healthier, and it will fight off pests better. No garden is going to be pest-free. I have some leaves that are eaten, but I also, when I see those eaten leaves, it tells me I need to do something. So to answer your question,
definitely
compost.
When you've got a strong plant, you've got a strong base. With that compost, you've got a stronger plant that can fight off the pests that we're dealing with as organic gardeners.
Very good. Yes.
Okay.
It's like you and I taking vitamins to get better.
Now, see, that makes perfect sense. It's you want to build a strong base for a strong body, strong plant.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that I have less issues. My only real issue that I've dealt with on a regular basis is whitefly. And I do think on the ones that have more compost, good finished compost in that bed, I've had less of an issue with that. I can't say that it's been no issue, but definitely less of an issue. So
I have whiteflies, and it's the time of year. Soon it'll be too cold for them, and they'll die. But you know what else I have out there? I've got spider webs all over. The whiteflies are there, so the spiders come to eat the whiteflies, and now there's webs like all over the plant. I don't mess with the spiders. I leave them alone because they're taking care of the whiteflies.
Man, I don't know if I can wish for spiders, though, Donna. That's asking a lot for me. That's asking a lot. As long as the spiders stay in their place, I guess it's okay. Now, I know that you're going to come back, and we're going to do the second part of this series, but just give us a little preview on what we're going to talk about in part 2 of Composting 201.
Yeah. In Composting 201, we're going to talk about what is actually happening to those layers. What's happening when you layer the dirt and the nitrogen, the greens and the browns, and why do we want that to happen, and how to attract more good microbes, and the difference between a good microbe and a bad microbe, and how to keep the bad microbes away. That sounds
great. And I know that we're going to have, well, we might have to give us an entire hour for that show. Well, Donna, I really want to thank you for coming tonight. Make sure that you visit Donna on her blog. That's sharinglife'sabundance.wordpress.com, and she's on facebook.com/sharinglife'sabundance. You're going to love all the things that Donna has to share. She is a wealth of knowledge. She's got 30 years experience, so don't miss that. And you can find me at imperfectlyhappy.com and facebook.com/imperfectlyhappy.